Well, here we are today, March 5th, 2120. Past week seems to have just about flown by for me. Maybe not for you folks. Everybody has their own perception of time, but I find the older I get, the more those weeks just zoom by, or even the year just zooms by, although this past year has certainly been times when it seemed to drag. The world sure has changed in the past year. It's just about almost exactly a year right now since everything went into effective lockdown with the pandemic, but we've adapted remarkably well. And as I've said on some previous weeks, the amateur market, the collector market is still very good. And actually collectible instruments seem to be, in many cases, doing as well as ever. But professional musicians still aren't making a lot of money yet. And the pandemic certainly has influenced our economy. And a lot of political, economic, and other upheaval is certainly still very much happening. At any rate, here we go for another question and answer session, and we have some pretty good questions today. Jeff has a question, and this is one that comes up surprisingly frequently. It may not always be in the same price bracket as his inquiry, but it still is a very common question. Jeff, I have a question. How do I convince my wife to let me buy a $2,000 guitar? I am retired and have been playing guitar for myself for more than 30 years. She says I have very little musical talent, but I can play okay. But there's no hope that I will ever play for an audience. Help! Well, Jeff, you're not alone in having to convince your wife or family that you should be able to buy something that makes you happy. But there is something about a guitar that actually you can tell the truth and justify being able to have it. Aside from the fact you would enjoy having it, and a good guitar gives more pleasure than a mediocre one, because a truly good one feels alive and is fun to play and is more inspirational, will improve your attitude toward playing and just make it a happy experience. Guitars are not consumed by being used. For example, if you buy an expensive custom tailored set of clothing, it has no resale value. If you buy a very expensive bottle of wine, the moment you open it, you better consume it quick because it will spoil immediately. If you don't consume it, it doesn't store well once opened. And once consumed with the wine, within a couple of hours, you have urine, and that's not resaleable. If you have an expensive meal, the next morning you may have poop, but that's not resaleable either. The guitar you can play for year after year after year. It's not being spent, it's an investment. And if you buy it and hold it for years, in all probability, it's going to be worth a lot more. In previous presentations over the weeks, in fact, last week we went over a early 1970s Gruhn price list, and some of the items that we were asking under $1,000 for now would bring over $100,000. Well, not everything is going to go up that much, but the point is a guitar can be an investment, and they do last with proper care. Your kids can inherit it, their kids can inherit it, and their kids can inherit it. There's no reason why a guitar with proper care is not going to last over 150 years. Martin's been in business since 1833, and I can show you an 1842 model. I've had it on screen in previous weeks, but the point is it's still playable. And for $2,000 or even less, you can get a good guitar. And I can show you some examples. For example, right now, here's a Martin DSS-17. They also offer this type guitar in a 000 size, but this is a slope-shouldered dreadnought. It has a Sitka spruce top, lightly braced, Indian rosewood bridge and fingerboard. It's a light matte finish, but it's a very light finish that it's thin, makes it very responsive. And the back and sides are mahogany. It's South American type mahogany grown on a tree farm in Fiji. And this guitar sounds good. It's $1,559 map price, minimum advertised price. And I can play a quick tune. It sounds good. I enjoy playing it. So there's an example of an American-made guitar made in Martin's Nazareth factory, a very good quality instrument, not fancy, but it plays extremely well. It sounds good, and $1,559. Frankly, it used to be that you couldn't get something in that price bracket, and price bracket, we'll talk about inflation adjusted, because how many hours of labor does it take you to buy one? You know, in 1970, prices were cheaper, but wages were too. So minimum wage was not as much, and what even if people got over minimum wage, they weren't getting what they do today. Here's a Taylor guitar. This is a Grand Pacific size, and this is there's a model AD-17 Grand Pacific. It's a Andy Powers design with their V brace. And this is an acoustic. There's no electronics in it, but it's a good acoustic guitar. Sitka spruce top. It has well-figured. This is a good quality instrument. And this model Taylor is $1,399. And it's also, this is a good guitar. It's a matte finish. It's very plain. It's in many ways similar in specs to that Martin, although it's a Taylor, and the bracing pattern is different. Martin has X bracing. This has the Taylor Andy Powers design V brace. But this, so far as sound, is right on up with some of the more expensive, more ornamented Taylors. But this is a US-made instrument. This is not a Mexican factory Taylor. This is a US Taylor, and it's a truly good instrument. They're the same too. What I can say about both of these guitars, and not just these two models, is that although these are in a price bracket that most amateur players can easily afford, they play well, they sound good. The neck contour is essentially exactly the same as on the more expensive models. The intonation and setup is just as good as on the expensive models. Because if you're doing a neck on a CNC machine, computer numeric control, you can run the same program on an expensive neck, an inexpensive neck, and it's the same amount of labor, And you can be using similar wood, and it will cut the dimensions to within 1/1000th of an inch of the same. And the fret scale is also cut on numeric controlled equipment. So they intonate just as accurately. The action can be just as good. The neck can be the same contour. It's not as expensive wood as on their most expensive model. It has a matte finish, which is cheaper for them to do, but it's a very thin finish, which leaves the instrument very responsive acoustically, very vibrantly alive. They are good guitars. But there are things that are affordable now because CNC equipment actually makes it less expensive to produce guitars in quantity with consistent specifications. And on guitars in this general price bracket, and we can even talk inflation adjusted, because these guitars actually inflation adjusted cost less than some of the upper level Harmony and K guitars did inflation adjusted that were made in 1960. And the K and Harmonies were nowhere remotely near as good as this. So the quality of the affordably priced, in effect, student or upper level student grade instruments are really bang for buck a much better deal now than they were when I started collecting, or even when I opened up my shop. In 1970, guitars were not being made with CNC equipment. They did not typically on instruments affordably priced have as good intonation. But keep in mind, 1970 was 51 years ago. And the quality of guitars that were affordable and inflation adjusted by number of hours of labor that it took the average person to have to work to be able to buy the guitar. These guitars that I just showed cost less money than much poorer quality instruments did in 1970 or in 1960. So today, actually, there are good options. But the thing about convincing the wife to let you buy, that can be whether it's a $1,000, $2,000, or even $20,000 or $25,000 or $30,000 or $50,000 guitar. Why should the wife let you do this? The answer is, if you can afford it and you have investments such as, for example, money in the bank. Well, money in the bank isn't earning even 1% interest these days. Money in the stock market, it can be risky. I personally would rather have my money in guitars. And I not only buy guitars and sell guitars, I do collect. And in the past year, I've been spending more guitar money myself, draining my bank account, my personal account of cash, and putting it into guitars to keep for my own personal collection. And part of that is because I really like guitars, but the other part is money sitting in the bank account, savings or checking, is really not, it's losing money because the interest they pay you is less. And money in the stock market right now, frankly, makes me nervous. The federal economy is out of balance, and there's a lot of things going on that are weird. And I'm just more comfortable with something I know about. But I do have some customers, in fact, one whose wife is a stockbroker, and she has always complimented her husband on socking away money into guitars because it's been better than the stock market indexes have been for many of the years that he's been collecting. At any rate, that's what I can say about that. Before getting on to other questions, I'm going to show a fun guitar that has come in that I think is of interest. And it's just right here. This is Norman Blake's prototype #1 Norman Blake model guitar. It was made in 2003. This was a very limited edition. in Brazilian rosewood, but this is prototype number 1 of 4, and it was Norman's personal guitar. It has very well figured Brazilian rosewood back and sides, which is not always easy to capture on camera, but this is, if you were to buy this new from Martin and order it custom shop, they have a very limited amount of Brazilian in stock. And for their sort of intermediate grade Brazilian, they charge dealer cost, well, the retail $25,000, and dealer cost is half that. But this would be the grade that would be $50,000 upgrade retail, and dealer cost 25. But this guitar is available right now, being signed by Norman Blake. Comes with photos, letter, and a video of him with this guitar, and it's priced at $17,500. Well, it's not quite in tune, but it is a great sounding guitar. And it is something I don't expect to be around for long, but if somebody's interested, there it be. So that's the fun toy of the day. I've known Norman quite well since 1969. He used to give guitar lessons in my shop the first year we were in business. I used to be over at his house as much as 3 nights a week back then. But we still stay very much in touch. He's one of my all-time favorite guitar players. Karsten has a question, which is regarding the types of wood that were used in the golden era guitars. Are they still available today? Except for Brazilian rosewood, are they from the same location, species as in the golden era, or are they different sources? Have any guitar brands tried to negotiate with the Brazilian government? Well, so far as negotiating with the Brazilian government over the specification of Brazilian rosewood in Appendix 1 of the CITES Treaty, even the Brazilian government can't simply unilaterally decide to ship Brazilian rosewood guitars or Brazilian rosewood logs or any Brazilian rosewood in any form out. The CITES Treaty is an international treaty signed by over 160 countries. And it has classified Brazilian rosewood in Appendix 1, which is the most endangered and most restricted. If the wood was cut prior to listing in that CITES category, which was June 11th of 1992 in the case of Brazilian rosewood, it is legal, but only with a pre-CITES certificate, which means you have to prove that the tree was cut before June 11th of 1992. And at this point, it's hard to get wood that was cut before then. So also the paperwork process that you must go through is very rigorous, to the point where most companies are simply no longer making Brazilian rosewood new guitars. A few luthiers have some wood left over. Martin has a little bit, but they charge an extraordinarily high price for it. And nobody is going to have any luck negotiating with the Brazilian government over that status, because removing it from CITES is almost impossible. And no one country can do it unilaterally. So there are processes by which it could be removed from that status, but at this rate, Brazilian rosewood is not going to be imported in any significant quantity unless they can demonstrate that it was old wood cut before that date. And even then, the process of getting the paperwork to make that legal, even if you do have wood that's legal, exporting it still requires a permit, so that shipping it internationally for a completed guitar is also a problem. And for musicians traveling with their guitar, it's risky. You could have it confiscated, and in many cases, there's no good way to get it back. So that's not likely to happen. But for the other woods, almost all the guitar woods are still available. And in many cases, they're still available from the same locations, although some species, like mahogany, grows through the Caribbean uh, into southern Mexico, throughout Central America, downward into Brazil, but it's that one species uh, grows over a pretty wide area. And for example, the sinker mahogany that is being featured on some of our custom guitars is from Belize, but that's very close to the Honduras border. It's sometimes often called the Honduras mahogany, but that species covers a wider range than just Honduras. And the quality can be just as good from other locations. And the quality of wood also varies depending on whether it's secondary growth that grew in a more open, more sunlit area or in a dim forest. Rainforests can be pretty dimly lit. Trees can grow rather slowly, at least starting out in rather dim light, and struggling to get up to the canopy, but that takes time. And in a tree farm, they grow quicker. And for example, the DSS 17 Martin I showed a little while ago, that is Fiji, where it is not native, but it's grown on a tree farm. It's lighter weight than the same species of mahogany that grows in South America. But the soil conditions are different. The climate conditions are a bit different. You know, they're both tropical. South America and Fiji are both tropical, but Fiji's a South Pacific island. And the wood grows quicker in Fiji in the tree farm. And the end result is wood that actually looks a bit different and is lighter in weight, and it sounds a bit different. But that DSS 17 is a vibrantly alive, actually very good sounding guitar that I personally enjoy playing. So there are guitars I sell that are a lot more money, and they have a different tone, but I can assure you that for somebody wanting an affordable guitar, that DSS 17 is a great guitar, and that Taylor Grand Pacific, the AD 17, is also a very good guitar. So, and they're not the only guitars in that price bracket that are good bang for buck, but if I'm going to pick two, I happen to be highly impressed with those, and Martin and Taylor also make other models that are similar quality and similar price bracket. Martin makes other 17 styles like the 0017. That's basically the same wood, the same construction, but it's a smaller guitar and has a somewhat different tone. But almost any of the species of wood that used to be used are still available. Prices tend to be higher, and rainforest woods are endangered. Any wood from Madagascar is extremely endangered and probably won't be available much longer. And at the rate Indonesian rainforests are being cut, I wonder how much longer they'll be there. I think 20 years from now, there may be virtually no rainforest left in Indonesia. And that's going to be problematic. And some areas of Africa, the environment is being raped, and some areas in South America as well. But there's enough wood currently available that the types of wood being used today are still often enough some of the same species as before. And for individual luthiers, they're certainly not a great problem. The wood costs more, but the guitars are expensive. They can afford the wood. For the mass manufacturers, Taylor, Gibson, Martin, there can be struggles. You know, most Fender has less trouble in a way because they're using wood that's more readily available, but even their ash, with the emerald ash borer insect and fungus it carries, that's a real problem. Fender is restricting the use of ash to custom shop models rather than on the lower line models. But they'll still have wood out there to make good quality guitars in the foreseeable future. But anyway, that's what I can say on that. Jeffrey has a question regarding what is the status of the CITES treaty as of March 2012? Any recent changes? Who would you consider the best living luthier alive today of dreadnought guitars? That's two separate questions. So far as, are there major changes in the CITES treaty from 2012 to the present as affects guitars? I mean, if you're talking about various other wildlife, plant and animal, there's been quite a few changes, but the status of Brazilian rosewood hasn't changed. The status of Indian rosewood did change, and it required more permits and more paperwork than used to be. And the status of ivory has also gotten more rigorous, even to the point where things that looked like they could be confused, it's getting hard to even import and export mammoth and mastodon ivory. And we can't save the extinct mammoth or the extinct mastodon. They've been extinct for, in the case of mastodons, tens of thousands of years, and mammoths at least for close to 10,000 years, with the exception of one island in the Arctic. But apparently the small mammoths there may have lasted as recently as 4,500 years ago. But still, we can't bring them back. But for the most part, the CITES regulations that have been the most difficult have been, since 2012, the classification of Indian rosewood into Appendix 2 and the requirement that it needs paperwork that is difficult for manufacturers and importers of the raw lumber. It has not made it especially more difficult for owners of Indian rosewood guitars or for guitars to be shipped, but it's made it much more difficult to get the lumber in. And so that has been a change. But again, that's not going to be a major issue for most guitar owners right now. Nicholas says, I love 12-string guitars, but find that they can be hard to play without a wide nut. I see lots of players using Guild 12-string, but who, in your opinion, makes the best sounding and most playable 12-string guitars? Taylor is certainly known for their 12 strings. Guild has always been known for 12 strings. And Martin has been doing 12 strings since the mid-1960s. And I think that all three of those companies make a good 12 string at the present time. And my favorite 12 strings for the moment happen to be Sinker Mahogany, custom shop of my design, quadruple O size, 16-inch wide, 12 fret slot head, 12 string. And I don't have one of those handy right now on this, right within reach at the moment. They're downstairs, but they're on our website. If anybody's interested, it's easy enough to look at them online. But they are similar in size to Leadbelly's guitar, 16-inch wide, Sinker Mahogany that was cut in Belize. And they were logging there between 100 to 140 years ago, about 1880 to 1920. And they're extremely good guitars, and they have a 1 13/16 inch nut width, which works out very comfortably for a 12 string. So anyway, that's something that I can highly recommend. Also, I remember now that Karsten had one other question. Well, let's see. Oh, it was Jeffrey's question I didn't answer. Who would you consider to be the best living luthier alive today of dreadnought guitars? I have hesitancy trying to answer that question with regard to any type guitar. And especially, is it the best manufacturer or is it the best individual luthier? And how does one define best? My best sellers, new, tend to be Martins and Taylors. So far as, but if you talk about jazz guitars, well, John Monleone right now gets more money for a new archtop guitar than any other living luthier. And certainly, if that's an indication of how much people are willing to pay, if that has something to do with quality, then John's getting many guitars he's selling are well over $100,000 for a new guitar, and some have been over $200,000. But so far as which ones do I do the best with here at my stores? New, I sell more new Martins than any other brand, and I sell a heck of a lot of new Taylors as well. And bang for buck, those two are very good makers. And the custom shop Martins that I'm selling, in my opinion, are very much equivalent to what some individual luthiers who charge many multiples more. So far as quality of sound and playability, I can put up some of those custom shop Martins that we're selling for under $5,000 up against other guitars at maybe $25,000. I'm still plenty happy with the quality of some of the custom shop Martins that I'm getting in. They're very, very fine instruments. And they're some of the finest new guitars that I've played. And our modern luthiers beating the quality of some of the electric guitars of the 1950s. I don't think they're beating them. Although, so far as if you're playing through a bunch of digital effects, frankly, the new ones, especially if you have a low noise pickup like EMG, that may not sound all that great with no modification, but if you're going to want a low noise pickup and then run it through a whole bunch of pedals and other effects, low noise is where it's at, because otherwise you end up with a lot of background hiss. And for a lot of modern players, there are new guitars that suit them extremely well. And the workmanship on many new guitars, bang for buck, is surprisingly good. Have they beaten a good 1959 Sunburst Les Paul? In my opinion, no. But as far as workmanship, is a new Collins or Santa Cruz, is it as neat and clean as the vintage guitars of the golden era? The answer is yes, they are. And in some cases, they're actually neater and cleaner. But in some cases also, the inlays are laser cut. And there are things that you can do to greater tolerance, standards of tolerance than you can do by hand, but there's a different look to it. And you can also do engraving that's mechanically done, numerically driven equipment, and maybe even laser cut, which does not look the same as hand engraving. On close high magnification, it may be neater and cleaner, but there's a certain flair to the hand engraving that looks different and has more soul and personality. So far as sound and playability, a really fine handcrafted guitar has more soul and personality than most of what you can do on a computer numeric system. But the computer numeric systems do extremely well for many aspects of manufacturing. And even some very, very fine builders can do cutting with the CNC machine and then do some final hand tweaking using judgment and tapping on wood and just tuning it in a little bit. But the fact is still the quality of new guitars is very good. And I'm not going to try to come down with the finest builder of dreadnoughts, the most famous builder of dreadnoughts, and the inventor of the dreadnought in the first place is Martin. There are plenty of others that are building them. And if it comes down to the best dreadnoughts, seem to be the ones that most closely resemble the mid-1930s Martins. And Martin does a darn good job of doing that right now. There are other builders, Santa Cruz, Collings, and a company called Pre-War. There's Huss and Dalton. There's numerous other makers. But the ones that seem to be the most sought after as dreadnought guitars are the ones that most closely resemble an old Martin dreadnought. But I'm not going to try to narrow it down any more than that. There's quite a few good builders out there. John C. I once owned a 1958 Gibson dot-neck ES335 with humbucker pickups that I purchased used in 1962 for $285, including case. What is it about this model that has made it such a very expensive vintage collector's item? Could it be because it was the first thin line, semi-hollow body to be offered by Gibson? Or was it perhaps a limited production run that year? I would appreciate your thoughts on this one. Well, the first unfortunate thing is he only once owned it. He doesn't own it anymore, apparently. Because if he bought it in 62, it would have been considered a used guitar, not highly sought after, collectible. People didn't realize how good it really was. Because the new ones in 62 were still pretty darn good. In fact, in 62, the new ones most of them still had the transition year when they were going from patent applied for humbuckers to the patent numbered ones, but the early patent numbered ones were still quite good. Still would have had a stop tailpiece. It would have had the 1/11/16 inch nut width. And 62 was a transition year to go from dots to blocks on the fingerboard. But still a very good guitar. Even by 1970, 58 or 59 dot neck 335 was only bringing around $400. Today they bring around 59 would bring at least $40,000 for a clean one and more if it was natural finish. 58 is not worth more money than a 59. 58 is the first year. And it is historically significant, and it was the first Gibson thin line, double cutaway, semi-hollow guitar. But is a 58 worth more than a 59? The answer is no, because the neck set angle back was a little more on the 59 model, and it did better accommodating the standard height tunematic bridge. On the 58 model, the neck angle was a little shallower, and they picked the bridge was either resting right on the top or having a thinner tunematic saddle. The 58 model had the smaller frets. The 59 model had the full-size jumbo frets, and 59s are the most sought after year for 335s. But so far as limited production run in 1958, well, it was a low production. It was the first year of manufacture, but again, 58 and 59 were the first 2 years for the ES335. And why are they so valuable? They're very, very good. It's the exact same wiring harness that you'd have on a Sunburst Les Paul. The Sunburst Les Paul in 1958-59 was $265 new, and the 335 cost a bit more new than a Sunburst Les Paul did at that time. So the fact is, why is it valuable? It is a golden era guitar. It is the best of its kind. Nobody has built a better one since. So that's why they are valuable. Hetty says, I'd like to upgrade from my Martin Mexican-made instrument to something American and classic like a D28 or D35. However, I don't have unlimited budget. Should I buy vintage but not golden era, 50s, from the 60s or 70s perhaps, to get the broken in quality as new as possible used, or a brand new one and a lesser model? Well, if buying used and modern, is there any pivotal point where the quality really increased in recent memory? Well, the fact is, if you get a 1970s Martin or Gibson acoustic, frankly, they're not as good as the new ones are right now. If you get a 1960s Martin, they have Brazilian Rosewood if they're style 21 on up. They bring a lot more money, but are they better sounding or even as good sounding as the custom shop models that I have? The answer is no, they're not. So what I'd say there is that we are in an interesting time in history where you can buy a brand new guitar for less money than a vintage or used one of similar sound. To get a really true golden era Martin sound, you go back to the 1930s. You can get some pretty darn good ones in the 40s, but still wartime. Like if you want Adirondack spruce and that sound, that means you're going to be getting into 1945 or earlier and a 1945 Martin D28, to my ear, does not sound better than some of the new Indian rosewood with Adirondack spruce top with forward shifted scallop bracing that I'm selling new for under $5,000. And I don't recommend 1970s guitars generally over new ones. We have an interesting situation where even guitars of 5 years ago, the specifications of a Martin HD28 or D28 built 5 years ago are not the same as the new one. The new HD28 has been upgraded and has specs that are much more like the pre-World War II guitars as far as bracing pattern and ornamentation. It still has herringbone trim, slotted diamond inlays. 5 years ago, the HD28 had rear shifted bracing and had dot inlays rather than the slotted diamond inlays, and the neck dimensions are now more equivalent to some of the older ones with the 1 3/4 nut width, which I prefer. It comes down to a 5-year-old HD28 is not near as good a guitar as a brand new one. And right now, we're in this interesting time in history where some of the new guitars, bang for buck, are what I recommend. And the 1970s guitars are the ones that, often enough to get them set up well, you spend a lot of money also fixing them up, because by the time a guitar is 50 years old, acoustic, it's likely to need a neck set. The Martins made prior to 1985 don't have an adjustable rod, so if they have a warp in the neck at all, any bowing, that can be a plain and refret. You can set those up quite well, but it may spend a lot of money by the time you do a bridge reglue, any loose bracing, regluing, neck set angle adjustment. You can be spending well over $1,000 working on it to get it right, and it still doesn't sound as good as some of the brand new ones because the specs have changed. So each individual maker had their own particular golden era, but in general, I can say for most of the modern makers, some of their best stuff of the past 50 years is what they're making right now. And that's an interesting turn of events that if you have further questions, my email is real simple, george@guitars.com. Our phone number here, 615-256-2033. You can talk to my sales staff or direct to me. I'm here 6 days a week, and I'm happy to answer questions. Richard asks, is there much difference in tone, sustain, etc. in a Martin D18, D28, D35, D45? They have similar top woods and tone woods. Do the fancier binding appointments affect sound quality? Well, for the most part, ornamentation really doesn't do diddly squat for sound. It makes it look pretty and cost more. There are some folks who feel that the pearl trim on the edge of the pearly martins on the top is that routed groove to put that in, and that they think that that may have some impact on the way the top vibrates. Frankly, I don't hear much on that, and I'm not convinced that that is true. Besides, that binding material on the inside here on the edge, below that, right here coming out about there, you have curved lining so that the top's really not vibrating in that area. And if you have some abalone trim right on the extreme edge, that's over the curved lining. And it really doesn't make much sense to think that's going to truly change the tone. I don't hear it changing the tone. The D18 will sound different from the D35 or D28 or D45 because the 18 has mahogany back and sides and a Sitka spruce top on these, whereas the 28, 35, and 45 have rosewood, and they have, right now, most of those, well, actually the D28 does not have scalloped bracing, but the D18 does, the D45 does, but the D35s are braced a little lighter than the D28, but the tonal differences between a 28, 35, and 45 are pretty subtle, especially the HD28, the difference in sound between HD28, like a D41 or a D42 or a D45 is very minimal. But if you get something with Adirondack spruce, all of a sudden that changes. And the custom shop stuff that we are doing has non-torified Adirondack. That's very different sounding from Sitka. And it's also very different sounding from the Authentic Series Martins that they do their VTS vintage tone system, which is torified oven-baked wood, which I personally don't prefer. But again, there's a lot of personal preferences involved in that. What I can say is a new D18 or a new HD28 is actually bang for the buck, a really good guitar. And are you going to get a greatly different sound from a D45 versus an HD28? Not really, but the D45 looks plenty much more fancier. Tom Guerra asks, do you envision a point where vintage electrics, which have risen dramatically in value over the past 50 or so years, will lose their market as the baby boomers age out and are replaced by Generation Xers that may not have the same affinity to the instruments that Clapton, Bloomfield, Page, Hendrix et al. Played? Time will tell. And I always used to say I don't have a crystal ball to answer the questions about the future. And I have had people ask me what my guitar is going to be worth in 50 years. And always again, we now have a crystal ball. And if you look through the crystal ball, there it be, you can see the world's upside down. Everything's flipped. Unless, of course, you put something right up to it, in which case that's right side up and magnified if it's just in contact with the ball itself. But otherwise, the world's upside down. And I can't tell you what things are going to be worth 20 years from now, any more so than your stock market broker can tell you how much Microsoft stock or Tesla stock is going to be even next year. We don't know. But I would say that the golden era pieces are going to retain their value. If it's anything remotely like the art market, there's going to be some of these things that will be valuable for a long time to come. And the quality of the true vintage instruments is not simply nostalgia. They are absolutely amazing instruments. But the quality of new instruments these days is very good. And so far as utility tools for musicians to play on stage, that quality is now good enough that you can take new guitars and play them on stage and do very well with them. Plus, we don't know who's going to come along as far as individual luthiers or small companies now that may grow. Martin was a little company. The year 1900, Martin had less than 10 employees. Now they have hundreds. So I can't tell you everything about the long run, but I can tell you that the market is in the middle of great demographic shift. I'm 75, and I'm sort of the oldest of the baby boomers. Actually, I'm like 3 months or 4 months, barely over 3 months before officially baby boomers start, because I'm August 21st of 45 and 46 onward is baby boomers. So far as I'm concerned, I'm a baby boomer, but technically I'm not because I wasn't born in 46. But today there's Generation Xers who think that guitars from the early 70s are really neat and nostalgic, but they're not the quality of what's being made right now. And they're darn well not the quality of a pre-CBS Fender or a Ted McCarty era Gibson. But I would say that the true golden era instruments are going to retain value and will continue to be valuable. And right now, at this moment in time, the true vintage golden era pieces are doing very well. And we're having difficulty getting enough of them to keep up with the demand. And they are selling better now than they were even a couple of years ago. They did go into a bubble between 2002 and late 2006 when some of the things went up over tenfold. And they did have a bit of a crash starting, especially around 2008. But it really more started in the mid-2007. But a lot of that's recovered back to about where it was. And a few things are not back yet to what they were then. Some things like lower signed F5 mandolins they're dramatically down now. Flathead master tone banjos are down from their peak, but that's not what you asked about. Point is, we can't tell you with any real accuracy how much things are going to be worth in the future. But we can say that it is true that that which is nostalgic to baby boomers is not necessarily nostalgic to younger folks. What you sort of imprint on and want for the rest of your life is things that were what you wanted upon hitting puberty versus up to about age 20. That you dialed in what kind of music you were going to like, and probably even what kind of instruments, even what kind of cars you might aspire to in the future. And then if you have your midlife crisis at age 40, well, you go back to what was then what you wanted, either get the original or something new, and sometimes maybe even the supernormal stimulus if you wanted a D45, but now you can get a D100. Ooh, that's more fancy, you can get that. But it's still dialing in what you wanted, except that maybe you want either that or the supernormal stimulus thereof. At any rate, yes, that will change. On the other hand, Vincent van Gogh paintings have been steadily going up, and that's gone from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. Picasso paintings, Van Gogh paintings, Rembrandt's, Michelangelo, and Da Vinci, they've gone from generation to generation because they just are really that great that it crosses over. And I think and really feel deeply that some of these finest American instruments, both acoustic and electric, have some of that type of appeal where it can cross generations. In fact, they'll cross generations a lot better than stuff that's memorabilia only, simply because valuable because of who owned it. Who owned it often enough is only good for one generation. And the Beatles will go on longer, but like Conway Twitty's Gretsch guitar brought a lot of money right after he died in an auction. But right now, I think you probably, a lot of the reaction would be Conway who. And another example is we have the guitar right now that was owned by Red Foley. Let's see where I put it. It's been moved on the wall, but anyway, I have one. I'd shown it last week. I think it 1956 Guild F50 top of the line as Red Foley inlaid on the fingerboard in big script. It's actually a really neat guitar. And Red Foley in his day was one of the absolute biggest selling country artists of the time. And it's a historically very significant instrument. I put it. Anyway, it's I think in the next row over, but I've shown it before. It's less appeal right now than if it belonged to Hank Williams, way less. But Hank Williams in his day did not sell any more records than Red Foley did. Red Foley was probably made more money in his lifetime than Hank did. Hank died at age 29, but now Hank's remembered. But the point is, memorabilia can be fleeting. The Liberace Museum in Vegas closed because Liberace appealed very much to my grandmother, but people today wouldn't pay to go see his outfits or his fancy piano. FAC says, have your customer profile changed in the past 10 years? Who are buying vintage guitars? Are young musicians buying vintage instruments? What do you think about PRS guitars? Well, it's a separate question, but PRS makes very good guitars. And the earliest PRS guitars are still quite collectible. If you get one from 1985, first year, I was at the trade show where they introduced them. I wish I'd bought some of those in 85 and hung on to them because those bring serious money. The newer ones are really fine utility instruments and not necessarily highly collectible, but they are excellent quality workmanship and playability. But what are young musicians? Are young musicians buying vintage instruments? The answer is actually some of them are. But most of the young ones don't have the budget to buy the really high-end vintage. Has the customer profile changed in the past 10 years? The answer is absolutely yes, because fewer baby boomers are buying right now. I'm 75, and most of my customers are younger. The people who are my age are often downsizing, and they may have bought a smaller house. The kids have moved on, and maybe they're retired by now. I don't have any intention of retiring, but most folks my age have retired or are certainly contemplating it. And I'm not contemplating retirement for me. I don't want to retire. I'm having a lot of fun here. And I get to do all the fun stuff, and I can delegate anything I don't want to do to somebody else, which is nice about having a staff. But I get to do constructive, fun stuff, and I'm still actively designing new models, which I truly enjoy doing. In fact, I feel that part of my legacy is basically the company, which can go on longer than me, since my stepson Eric is company president and general manager and has every intention of continuing it, and is the heir to the business. My writing and research work, which can be passed on, that is a legacy over the years. I and my staff have done a great deal of research, and we try to make that publicly available. And the models of guitars I design live on. Some have influenced even other makers, but just doing my first Guild Nightbird model prototype goes back to 1985. Was the earliest that I know of making a semi-hollow guitar by routing the back and doing it basically in a pattern that gives you acoustic response because it's only solid under the pickups and the rest of it is routed hollow, but it's still one piece of wood. And the work of building it is not much different than doing a solid body guitar. You don't need bent sides, no neck block, no end block, no curved linings, but it still produces a hollow guitar that gives acoustic response and also, though, can be cranked up as loud as most solid body guitars. But I have a legacy of designing for Guild. I've done a lot of custom models, and these guitars are sort of little ambassadors for me. They go out there around the world and can last with good care a couple hundred years. And it's just like violin makers, like Del Gesù Guarneri didn't make very many violins, died in the early 1740s. He didn't live as long as Stradivarius, but today his guitar, violins and Strads bring similar money. They can bring over $10 million. Stradivari lived to be 94 and is still making violins at age 93, but he produced quite a few instruments. You know, and in fact, there's close to 650 Stradivari violins still in existence today that are well documented. And his memory is such that most of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are not household names, but Stradivari is world famous. And Guarneri, Del Gesù Guarneri, also world famous, not quite as well known as Stradivari as far as a common household name, but among any musician, yeah, Del Gesù Guarneri is known, but Stradivarius is known everywhere. Or even D'Angelico didn't make very many guitars over his lifetime. It was right around close to 1,100 guitars, but he's world famous, and he died in 1964, and he didn't get wealthy at it when he was alive, but his name is probably known by more people than most of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who be making, some of them are making tens of millions of dollars a year. So it depends how you gauge success. But at any rate, I still think that great instruments of the golden era will remain valuable. And some of these do have the appeal that will cross generations, but some of the memorabilia pieces, just expensive because so-and-so owned one, some of that may not keep its value. And when somebody pays over $6 million for a Kurt Cobain Martin D18E, I find that hard to understand. Or Gary Gilmore's Stratocaster that brought over $4 million. Pink Floyd. I don't get it. I don't see that as being a great investment long term, but that's a personal opinion. Philip Gillis asks, are you writing another book? You were the only author who had my 1939 Gretsch Electromatic with details in a research book. Keep up the good work. Luthier. Philip. Well, yes, I am working on another book, but it's going to be a rather different book. It's going to be a book that covers a lot of my general thoughts about instruments, but much more than that, instruments and how they tie into an interconnected world. So I'll be talking about world ecology, rainforest preservation, just ecological preservation. Our world is interconnected, and our air is becoming polluted to the point it's hard to breathe and it rains acid. Our water is becoming polluted, and fresh water is in short supply. Our topsoils in the great areas of the agricultural areas of the world is half the thickness it was when I was born. Many of the aquifers are 70% drained since I was born. The oceans are turning a bit acidic, and the biodiversity, a lot of the fish in the oceans are very severely cramped, especially from global warming. Clean fuel is a problem, at least carbon footprint of the average person is much greater than it used to be. The amount of trash we throw out is greater than it used to be. Antibiotics are being fed to our poultry and cattle, and our bacteria are becoming resistant to almost all the medications we can throw at them. And if you can't breathe, and you can't drink, and you can't eat, and you are running out of fuel, and your medicines don't work, that's going to cut back standard of living and foul up the guitar market. So anyway, that's some of what I'll be writing about. But it's an interconnected world. And the fact is, you can't build guitars without wood unless you're doing graphite guitars. Those graphite guitars are not ecologically more friendly than a wood guitar. Plastics in general are also not ecologically friendly. So there are many issues out there, but I do have a background in zoology academically, and I'm interested in tying a lot of that together, and even general theories of the market. Like I was talking earlier about baby boomers, and they have different preferences through their musical imprinting when they were puberty through age 20. Well, each generation has that. They're imprinting on something different. So like, what's going to be a hot trend 40 years from now? Well, it's likely to be Mark Twain says history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. Well, people who today are puberty through 20 years from now are going to be the ones starting to have a midlife crisis and want to go out and buy things. And it's likely to be either buying ones that were the ones they wanted but couldn't afford now, but can 20 years from now, or things similar to them. Musical trends may be for them somewhat similar. They may still like some of the same bands that they listen to now, or they may still listen to music that's reminiscent of it, or instruments and even cars. Cars are changing so fast that 20 years from now, they may not be able to get a car that's the one they aspire to now, because 20 years from now, a lot of the cars may not even have a steering wheel, and you may not be able to drive them. They may be autonomous, and that'll take a lot of the fun out of driving. But that's another thing that can change the world. The world has changed. We shall see. But even if you want to know what's going to be popular 10 years from now rather than 20 years from now, you don't look at what I want, because 10 years from now I'd be 85. And you look at still the people who they want what they wanted from age puberty through 20. And then you can project that into the future, that when they hit age 40, what will they be after? And that's 3 times in a person's life that they're likely to be buying guitars: puberty through early 20s, 40 through 50, and then on retirement you may get some more. That's sort of the way it's been for cars. But with guitars, if you bought them at age 40 and you now have 50 or even 100 of them, you see when you hit 65 or 70, you still have those. If you didn't sell them, they're still just as good because they last for 200 years. But a car wears out. So if you bought a Lamborghini when you were, or a Ferrari when you were 40, when you hit 65, you might get another one, because you realize that if you wait till you're 80, you won't be able to drive it. You're not going to have the reflexes and whatever. But even at 75, I got the reflexes. I could drive one of those. But then I don't want a Ferrari, because fun behind the wheel does things that are not street legal. You got flashing blue lights behind you and you pay big penalties. Or else you get in an accident and you could wreck the car, or you might hurt yourself or kill yourself. And you might, if you lose control, even take out a family, an innocent family of 6 in some other car. You might take them out with you. It's a lot safer to try out the ideas on the guitar. Good guitars are just fun, and they're inspiring. They're great pieces of art. They're visually appealing. They look good. They feel good. They sound good, and they're interactive so that you can play it. And once you play it, it's a whole different experience than hearing somebody else play it. It's putting on a power suit, even if you only play 3 first position chords. A good guitar, you just bond with it. It feels wonderful. In fact, Richard says, have you ever played new out-of-the-box Martin? It sounds so incredible that you've never forgot it. I once played circa 2000 D18 Clarence White. The blindfolded, I would have sworn, was from the 30s. Well, yeah, I've played some new ones that really, truly do inspire me. And right now, some of the best sounding new guitars I've ever heard are being made right now. I've been selling new guitars since 1970 with the store, and I can show you new guitars that inspire me. And you know, I just got in a new 12 fret quadruple O. It's my own design, but I've gotten 2 of them in, and it inspires me. And I showed it on camera last week, so I'll not show it again. We got too many questions, but there are new guitars right now that are very good, and I'm pleased at that. But yes, there are some fine ones, and they don't have to be old to sound good. The old ones are good because they were good to begin with, and they do break in, but they don't go from being mediocre to being wonderful just by being old. And you can take a brand new one out of the box and pound on it hard in a bluegrass jam for just even one night, and you can hear the difference. They break in really fast. And then they'll gradually still improve over time, but most of that improvement is in the first week of hard playing. And then you just warm it up each time you play it, bang on it hard for about 5 minutes of hard, loud playing, and then you can play soft and pretty. And Jose says, what's your opinion on master grade wood that some luthiers grade? Under what grading system do they use? In the US, there is no wood. Is there any wood grade nomenclature? The fact is, there really isn't a standardized grading system. And for the most part, the so-called master grade wood is pretty. But you can grade wood on how pretty it is, or you can tap on it. You can take a piece of wood. I don't have a piece of wood handy, but if you just hold a piece of wood like this and tap on it, it's tone. Much better tone than the magazine does. But if you pick a piece of wood up, you can tap on it. And some just rings almost like a bell. And some is a dull thud. And they can be the same species. And it's not necessarily always the prettiest wood that does that. But usually when manufacturers are talking about master grade, they're talking about spruce, uniform grain, close spaced, quarter cut for the spruce tops. Plenty of grain lines per inch and pretty uniform. But with rosewood or maple, often they're primarily talking about how highly figured the wood is. And just because maple has beautiful curly figure doesn't really mean that it's going to sound any better. And slab cut versus quarter cut, or at least some species is more structurally stable, and quarter cut is the best wood for spruce, for tops. But on backs and sides, maple can be slab cut and still work very well. Rosewood is structurally a bit stronger quarter cut, but slab cut maple and rosewood can still work quite well. Michael asks, George, what is your opinion on the market and collectability of lap steel guitars? Well, when I started out in business, they were ridiculously cheap. And now at least some models are sought after, although like a Rickenbacker frying pan model, the early ones can bring $3,000 or more. But most lap steels still bring significantly less money than a round neck standard style guitar. The market is a smaller market, but there are some really fine old lap steels that have very good tone. And they're one of the more affordable vintage instruments that is still fun to play and can have great tone. So that's something that overall lap steels are a bargain. And especially if you're just interested in a quality musical instrument, rather than simply how much money can you get for it 10 years from now. One of the best bang for buck items you can buy for having an instrument that is a fine musical instrument that you can play great sounding stuff on for a limited budget. Lap steels have got to be high up there because you can get vintage lap steels for under $1,000 and almost any of them under $2,000 that can be supremely good golden era items that sound absolutely wonderful. June Governal asks, are the guitars you just played solid top? The answer is yes. You have George Daly asks, do you have a guitar museum as part of your business? I have my personal collection on display as sort of a museum area. Jonathan Gottlieb asks, do you approve of installing a pickup in the sinker guitars? And if so, is there a pickup or type you would recommend? In general, frankly, if you want to pick up on a guitar, you don't need something that sounds as vibrantly alive acoustically as my sinkers do. They'll overdrive many pickups. And the guitars that work the best, amplified often enough, are not the ones that sound vibrantly alive acoustically. If you were going to put a pickup on, I think the Baggs Anthem does well, but in general, I view them as the sinkers as really truly acoustic guitars. Scott Richardson asks, would you please tell us how the Martin Style 18 sinkers differ in tone from your new Style 28 custom shop Martins? Rosewood and Mahogany are different tones. The Rosewood is a somewhat darker. They're very loud. It's a different tone. It would be like trying to explain the difference in flavor between chocolate and vanilla if you've never tasted either one. I can tell you that they are distinctly different. And that actually, in many ways, they're equally good. But the Sinker Mahogany has a sort of, it's a bit brighter sounding. And I'll take one last question, and that is, John Foley asks, today we see historic brand names such as Stromberg, Guild, and Jellicoe all being produced overseas. Should I buy these type of guitars? I'm an amateur player, but wonder about the future value. I would say this. Elmer Stromberg and John Jellicoe would turn over in their grave if they knew that their names had been sold, not in their lifetime, to folks making those things overseas, mass produced. Guild has also been sold and moved several times over its history, but the new Guilds made in the USA are good. The new Guilds made overseas are also good. They may never be collectible, but they are good guitars, bang for buck. They are just fine. And you get what you pay for, and what you pay for in a new Guild made overseas is actually worth it. It's a good guitar for the price. And It's not the same guild company as used to be. The company's changed ownership multiple times and moved, even for the American-made ones, multiple times. But they still are making good guitars in the USA, and their imports are good guitar quality for the price. Till next time, have a good one. I'll be happy to take more questions if I haven't answered one that you want answered. In the meantime, just contact me. Either call me right at the shop number, 615-256-2033. I'm available and I'll give you a one-on-one answer. Or you can email me, george@guitars.com, and I will personally answer your question.